Why should we read the Republic? I imagine lots of students ask this question to themselves when they're given it as a set book at the beginning of their university course. But in fact, there are many good reasons to read the Republic. And the first one I would pick on is just that it is immensely readable. It's not, Plato did not write philosophy like a dry textbook. He wrote it like a living conversation. The whole of the Republic, which is a fairly fat book, is a living conversation written in short, almost soundbite type answers, but nevertheless developing some very, very important ideas. So my first answer then, we should read the Republic just because it is readable. It was written by a genius and it's worth reading. It's easy to read. It's not difficult. But then there's also obviously the thought, the content of the book. And he's asking this absolutely fundamental question: why should we bother to be good? What's in it for us, effectively? It seems, when we look at the world, it looks as though injustice pays. It looks as though crime pays, whereas the good people get trodden down. So Plato addresses this absolutely fundamental question: why should we be good? I'm not going to tell you his answer. Read the book.
I'm 43 years old, and I owe tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. Oh, sure, I knew the loans were piling up as I went through school. But with one loan coming from here, another from there, I had no idea of the rock slide that was building. 15 years later, I still experience moments of sheer horror regarding my family's financial situation. My monthly student loan payment is more than triple my car payment. Okay, so without my college degree, I would not have been able to get my current job. For that I'm grateful, but at what cost? My loans have been accruing at a rate of 10%, and now they have burgeoned to, well, I'm an English major, you do the math. I don't think they'll ever get paid off. We're in debt way past our eyeballs, and there's no hope in sight. I'm being kept in class, a financial class of graduates whose only hope for attending college meant borrowing money from the government. Because of our mounting credit card debt and monthly payments that far exceed our family's income, my kids will also join the class of citizens who can't rely on their parents for college support. Do I wish I'd chosen another educational route? You bet. Perhaps trade school. I thought that being a plumber might not be such a bad gig. But if your job aspirations require a 4-year degree, take my advice and choose a college you can afford both during and after graduation. Take a realistic look at your anticipated income and factor in priorities that don't carry a price, like the spouse and children you might want to have someday. I was overconfident that my student loan debt would pale in comparison to the lucrative writing career I'd enjoy after graduation. Now I'm paying for that decision in more ways than I'd ever imagined.
Under appropriate conditions, mind you. Sound receptors. You've got sound receptors in your ear, and they're beautiful. We're not going to talk about them at any length, but there's little flappy, these little spiky things going along in your ear, and they can translate vibrational energy coming from your ear, hitting your eardrum, being translated into a vibration in the fluid in your ear, into a physical motion of these little receptors there, into an electrical motion, into an electrical signal that goes into your ear. So all that's pretty impressive stuff. We're not going to talk about the details of it, but I invite some of you who want to learn more about this, particularly MIT students, I think, find receptors to be really quite remarkable kinds of devices.
Language death is not mainstream theatre. It is not mainstream anything. Can you imagine Hollywood taking it on? It's so far outside the mindsets of most people that they have a difficulty appreciating what the crisis is all about because they're not used to thinking about language as an issue in itself. Somehow we need to change these mindsets. We need to get people thinking more about language, more explicitly, more intimately, more enthusiastically. Interest in language is certainly there in the general population. Most people are fascinated by such topics as where words come from, or what the origin of their town's name is, or whether their baby's name means anything. And they're certainly prepared to play Scrabble and a host of other language games ad infinitum. And you get language games on radio and television too, but a willingness to focus that interest on general issues, a preparedness to take on board the emotion and drama inherent in the situation of language endangerment is not something that happens much.
Today I want to talk about water and the law that surrounds drinking water, to talk about its quality, talk about what your rights are to clean water, to also give you a sense of what key threats are to drinking water, what your exposure might be, and what we might do about it, both legally but also personally. Water is a critical component of our environment and our bodies. Your body is close to 70% water. You can go for several weeks, 2 to 3 on average, without food. You can only go for about 4 minutes without air. And you can go for maybe 4 or 5 days without water before you die. So water is absolutely critical, and one of the key arguments I want to make today is that it's a largely neglected area of environmental law, given the rapid increase in our knowledge about chemical threats to water quality and where those threats come from.
Just over 10 years ago, when I was in the Royal Academy, a museum in the centre of London with my 3 children at the Aztec exhibition. I don't know if any of you saw it. I had an older child and 2 younger children. Twins is shown in this picture. And one of my children, 3 years old, shouted. And I've never denied he shouted. He shouted, "Monster." Monster? At this statue, which looked just like a monster. had snakes for hair, a big beak for a nose. And I thought, this is fantastic. I got a 3-year-old that's appreciating pre-Hispanic art. How good can it get? So I bent down. I said, yes, it looks just like a monster. And at that moment a security guard came over. Then a gallery assistant came over and said, we're being too noisy, and threw us out. Roll the family. During that time, I was a journalist with the Guardian newspaper, and 2 days later, I wrote a big piece in The Guardian about being thrown out of the Royal Academy. And what was really interesting was by the end of that day, at the paper we had over 500 emails from other families saying museums aren't working for us. Let's try and make it work. So that's what we did in the garden. We set up a campaign for the Kids Museums campaign. It didn't really exist. It was just a few pages long. Run those stories on it. I began touring the country talking about how to make your museum more family-friendly. I was a journalist. I was called in to see the then director of the National Gallery in London. I'll never forget this moment. When he, a communist, said, we really like this Kids Museums campaign and we've been talking on our board about it. We have some ideas of how we might work together, and I'd like you to take them back to your team.
Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the idea of the Industrial Revolution was that it was the work of some genius inventors who created machines used primarily in the textile industry, but also in mining, that eliminated blocks to assembly line production. Then everybody was crowded into factories, and the new brave world opened up. In fact, one of the most interesting books and great classics that is still in print was written by an economic historian at Harvard who's still alive, called David Landis. It's a good book called The Unbound Prometheus, which was basically that. Some of the inventions that I briefly describe in your reading, the spinning jenny, etc., refer to that. Well, and that kind of analysis led one to concentrate on England, where the Industrial Revolution began, and to view industrialization as being a situation of winners and losers by not going as fast. Now, that analysis has been really rejected greatly over the past years, because Industrial Revolution is measured by more than simply large factories with industrial workers and the number of machines. This is the point of the beginning of this. The more that we look at the Industrial Revolution, the more that we see that the Industrial Revolution was first and foremost an intensification of forms of production, of kinds of production that were already there. And thus, we spend more time looking at, the intensification of artisanal production, craft production, of domestic industry, which we've already mentioned. That is, people, mostly women, but also men and children too, working in the countryside. The rapid rise of industrial production was very much tied to traditional forms of production.
Emery Lovins. Who knows who Emery Lovins is? Nobody. Emery Lovins is an unusual character. He's something of polymath, just to say he sort of soaks up knowledge across a wide range of fields. He's not an academic. He has a consulting company which he runs off until he recently out of his home in Colorado. He lives outside Snowmass in a house built into the side of a mountain that has no furnace. For about 30 years, he has been kind of iconic plastic oddball genius, thinking of ways to save energy, thinking of ways to solve problems using technology that already exist. And he has demonstrated several of them. He also offers is something that he's such an oddball that people tend to think he's kind of crazy. Anyway, Elizabeth Colbert went and spent some time with Emery Lovins, and so he's written this piece called Mr. Green.
People often forget their cards after taking money from the ATM. Occasionally, this is the common reason, because they get the money and walk away. In the UK, it becomes less common because people take their money after they've taken their card. In the past, people made the error by forgetting to get their cards after their money. UK has restructured the new ATM system. You have to get your card before you get your cash. Although you would forget to get your money, it is more catastrophic if you lose your card because it can access your bank account. Before we consider international environmental law and climate change, we need to consider domestic legislation, as it is within the sovereign states that international law is put into practice. This reflects the environmentalist maxim, think globally, act locally. United Kingdom legislative control over the impacts of man's activity on the environment is not new. As long ago as the reign of Charles II, the main concern was the production of smoke from the burning of sea coal. Almost all areas of trade and industry were subject to very detailed legislative controls at that time, although some were governed by self-regulation in the form of guilds, who regulated both supply and methods of production. However, the measures implemented were mostly ineffective, because then, as now, the specifying of legal duties and standards without providing any appropriate enforcement merely indicated good intentions, but were of little practical effect. The next stage was prompted by the Industrial Revolution, with the urbanization of society and its profound effects on the environment. Local industrialists used the Adam Smith model to maximize their economic benefit, but this was to the detriment of the local environment with the operation of Gresham's law, that is, the bad drives out the good. Those industrialists who were concerned for either the health of their employees or the local environment faced higher costs than their competitors. The result was the need for increasingly comprehensive statutory controls on the discharge of pollutants into various receiving media. What is globalization? I think that it takes on a few different definitions in one sense of the word. Globalization means proliferation of transactions across country. So, one way of thinking about globalization is a way to describe increased international communications, more trade happening between countries, and be less self-sufficient in providing goods and services to their people, and more companies that have offices in multiple countries, which we call multinationals. So, the source of growth in travel and communication and corporate trade across borders. And this way of thinking about globalization is the continuation of thinking that has been around for a long time, such as when the Europeans went to the Orient to find spices, which was also an example of global trade and communication. Another way to think of globalization, though, is an economic system. It is a system in which countries become integrated in a way that never had been before. In this system, we see a global split in the process between consuming and producing goods. Some countries produce goods, some countries consume goods, and then these countries in different areas of the globe depend on each other in a kind of organic solidarity, rather than having an economic system being just inside your country. The system is the way economy in your country functions, depends on economy of another country. And in fact, this way of thinking about globalizations represents a new area of economic progression. The past industrialist economy has been a global issue.
The debt today is so high. It's 200,000 rupees. 300,000 rupees of peasants who have no capital. And they who know within a year or two, when they accumulate that kind of debt, they will never be able to pay back. Where is the debt coming from? It's coming from a seed that is costing 100,000 to 200,000 rupees per kilogram, depending on what you got. Seed that used to be free, used to be theirs. Pesticides each time, the more they use, the more they have to use. 12 sprays, 15 sprays, 20 sprays. Pesticide used in just the last 5 years in the large areas of India has shot up by 2,000%. That's why the free market and globalization have brought. And since we're talking about peasants who have no money, who have no capital, they can only buy expensive seeds and expensive pesticides by borrowing. And who lended that money? The same companies that sell the pesticides, which are the same companies that sell the seeds, as you know, are now also the major credit.
Music and language. Both music and language have a lot of similarities. They involve complex sequences that unfold in time. They are both forms of communication. This has interested all the world's best philosophers from Plato going back over 2,000 years ago. Scientists like Darwin wrote about possible evolutionary links between music and language in his book The Descent of Man. And so did artists like Leonard Bernstein, who gave a series of lectures at Harvard in the 70s. He spoke about the grammar of language and the grammar of music from Noam Chomsky's theories. So it's a persistent question. It keeps drawing interest from scientists today, but there are some basic obvious similarities. For example, both music and language have rhythmic, systematic patterns of timing, accent, and grouping. Both language and music have melody-structured patterns of pitch over time. Both have syntax discrete elements like words or notes, and principles for combining those elements into sequences. Sentences are just random sequences of words. Both convey affect, which means emotion using sound. You can make out a lot of emotion from a person's voice, and music has the characteristic of providing emotions like happiness or sadness.
Okay, to understand what vitamin D does, we need to understand the central concept. The function of vitamin D is to maintain blood calcium. You probably think the function of vitamin D is to maintain strong bones and teeth. But it does that by accident. Its real function is to maintain your blood calcium level in a very narrow range. And the reason for that is if your blood calcium level falls below about 9 milligrams per 100 milliliters, then you're longing to be in a big trouble and die rather quickly. And that's because blood calcium is important for muscle contraction and nerve transmission. And if you don't have enough of it, you can't contract muscles normally. There can't be normal nerve impulses. And this results in a disease called tetany, where you get these uncontrolled convulsions followed by rapid death. Calcium is also important for enzymic activities and blood clotting.
I think there is an intense competition at the moment to hire the most talented and most intellectually able people. There is a time when I think companies have many of the adventures in the world. That involves the company's world. It was the boss's world. Now I think it reverses the case. We have a shortage in talent base within countries and between countries, have an intense battle between companies to hire the most talented workers, and also between countries, which are looking to recruit talented young people, talented young immigrants. We have this sense of immigrants being things that countries are battled to keep out, and immigrants want to get in, climb the walls. I think the opposite isn't the case. And the topic is that countries are trying to lure bright young people to get them to go to universities and get them to become immigrants. So on many levels, talent is a premium. There is a shortage of talent, and so countries, companies, all sorts of organizations, of course, volunteer organizations as well, as are competing to hire the best and the brightest. You know, we have a baby boom population which is aging. We have an economy which is becoming more sophisticated. And so, for all those sorts of reasons, talent is a premium. That's it.
Laughter is one of the greatest therapies in combating adversity, and whole communities and nations have frequently relied on humor to get them through their bleakest times. On August 13, 1961, the barbed wire was rolled out of Berlin to create the Berlin Wall. For nearly 30 years, until it was dismantled, wall jokes proliferated, especially among those living in the East. Laughing was all that was left. It was a way of humanizing the tragedy of an ideology that had divided families and the nation. Wags would ask, "When does a good border guard fire the warning shot?" and answer with chilling wit, "At the end of the second clip of ammunition," thereby making light of the German Democratic Republicans' command to its border guards to shoot to kill anyone trying to cross the wall. Jokes about those who rule you, and sometimes those who tyrannize you, are a form of folklore that has existed in societies as seemingly different as communist in Eastern Europe, Tsarist Russia, modern Egypt, 12th century Persia, and modern-day Iran. Humor can also be wonderfully subversive. It can protect self-respect and identity.
There can be no reasonable science-based doubt about the reality of global climate change, effects brought on by the cumulative and rapidly growing emission of so-called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. As these effects become increasingly more obvious worldwide, so commercial interests, groups of concerned individuals, and national governments have been gripped by what amounts to mass panic about what to do about it. To many, Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian population bomb of 1968 appears about to explode in the world's face in an indirect version of his millenarian vision of population growth, which outpaces agricultural production capacity, with predictably catastrophic results for humanity. And his three-part crisis scenario does indeed seem now to be present: a rapid rate of change, a limit of some sort, and delays in perceiving that limit. Ehrlich's work was roundly criticized at that time, and later from many quarters, and much of what he predicted did not come about. Nevertheless, can a world afford to take the risk that the climate scientists have got it wrong? Is it not in everyone's interests to apply the precautionary principle in attempting to avoid the worst of their predictions, now rather than at some future time? As the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Rahendra Pukuri, has pointed out, 11 of the warmest years since instrumental records began have occurred in the past 12 years, while major precipitation changes are taking place on a global scale.
To understand the fight or flight response, it helps to think about the role of emotions in our lives. Many of us would prefer to focus on our logical, thinking nature and ignore our sometimes troublesome emotions, but emotions have a purpose. Our most basic emotions, like fear, anger, or disgust, are vital messengers. They evolved as signals to help us meet our basic needs for self-preservation and safety. It would be dangerous to be indecisive about a threat to our survival, so the brain runs information from our senses through the most primitive, reactive parts of our brain first. These areas of the brain control instinctive responses, and they don't do too much thinking. This most primitive part of our brain communicates with the rest of our brain and our body to create signals we can't ignore easily, powerful emotions and symptoms.
Today, a university like the LSE certainly has to acknowledge that it is in competition for the best students, all of whom have choices they can exercise, and many of them choices which run across national and continental borders. We are in competition, too, for staff. The academic job market is one of the most global there is, and in the 21st century, English is the new Latin, so universities in English-speaking countries are exposed to more intensive competition than those elsewhere. We are in competition for government funding through the assessment of research quality. We are in competition for research contracts from public and private sector sources, and indeed we are in competition for the philanthropic pound. Many of our own donors were at more than one university, and indeed think of the LSE's requests alongside those of other charities to which they are committed. That is the competitive environment which is particularly visible to a vice-chancellor.
Within most developed countries, notions of pragmatism, notions of the fact that we have democracies, have succeeded in tempering the market economy. In the 19th century, 18th century, the Industrial Revolution had some very negative effects on people, particularly working classes all over the world. We see data where life expectancy was reduced, heights were reduced. We can look at medical records and see that actually living standards in among large fractions of the population actually went down. But eventually we passed legislation about working conditions, and eventually we circumscribed some of the worst kinds of behavior. We eventually, in the 20th century, we put regulations that imposed better environmental conditions. And so some of the damage was reversed, and that we have made the market economy work in ways that the benefits of it are at least far more widely shared than they were 100 years ago.
In my view, it's impossible not to talk about wildlife. and not think about its role in livelihoods. And I guess part of that is my own view, part of the research that I do in Africa. In most East and West Africa, I look a role all the humans rely on wildlife as the source of food and also the source of income. And we talk about our wildlife. It seems we talk about fish. We are talking about what is probably the single most important source of protein for humans across the globe. And so billions or more than 1 billion people rely on fish as their primary source of animal protein. And most of these people live in poverty. So the management of wild fish resources, that sense, is incredibly important to livelihoods and health. And also, wildlife tourism is the multiple billion-dollar industry, and in many places, such as Africa. South America, it can be the number one source of income. It can be the number one source of foreign income for economies.
But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to their own devices, and they could build a city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way that was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise, and they everywhere they went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns, they would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. So when we begin to see the Romans building their ideal Roman city, they turn to that so-called castrum, or military camp design.
One of the things that was going on during the Great Depression was the beginning of the sort of modern food technology that rules, the way Americans eat today. That is, there are a lot of canned foods were coming onto the market at the time, and also refrigerators were really becoming very, very popular during the Great Depression. Both in cities and in rural parts of the country, thanks to electrification, the Rural Electrification Administration. People could buy appliances, farmers could buy appliances, and that meant frozen foods were becoming big. At that time, few people could afford to buy them during the early years of the Great Depression, but, gradually these things picked up. And so this was like the sort of beginning of the era when people were starting to think about supermarkets with rows and rows of freezer cases and rows of canned foods.
Now, the study of biology is responsible for some of the most profounding insights that humans have about the world around them. So take a look at these 4 panoramas. In the upper left, you see some bacteria. This happen to be equal line. You obviously see a butterfly, a flower, a dolphin. If you see that at the outer space just looks these different forms and structures, you have no idea that they were all related to one to another. So one of the most profound things that biology told us is that all life on Earth is exceptionally related similar to one to another. So for example, all of these life forms rely on DNA and RNA for storing and transmitting and using their genetic and inherited information. They are all based on cell. Cell is the fundamental building blocks of all life. All of these organisms consist of cells, and the cells essentially have the same chemicals inside of them: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and the whole bunch of other stuff in much smaller amount. All these organisms conducted metabolism, in other words, chemical reactions that using convert energy from one form to another. And the basic chemistry is all very similar to one and another. The types of molecule is used very similar to one and another.
Well, a historical linguist compares languages at several levels. You start out looking for basic vocabulary. All languages of the world, natural languages at least, have words for eye and head and nose and ear, and for sky and earth, and for water, sand, and for sibling, mother and father. They may not have words for uncle and aunt. It becomes much vaguer, because in one culture an aunt is different when it comes from your father's side than from your mother's side. You don't include snow. Most people know what snow is, but in the tropics you don't have it. So you look for notions that are totally comparable and that occur everywhere in the world. You take the 100 or 200 most universal notions in a human life. That is what you call a basic vocabulary. So you take basic vocabularies in languages that you think are related. You look for words that sound the same.
Vitamin D version 2. So today we're going to finish talking about the fat-soluble vitamins. I'm going to start with vitamin D. And I think probably most of you know that vitamin D is called the sunshine vitamin. And it's called that because there's absolutely no dietary need for vitamin D if you get adequate sunshine. And the real important word there is it, because it turns out that in climates which aren't near the equator, there's a big question as to whether or not using these you get adequate sunshine. And that's important because foods are not naturally abundant in vitamin D. And that's why milk is fortified, but the fortification may not be enough. So again, just exposure to sunlight is adequate, no need for vitamin D. So vitamin D really isn't the vitamin, it's a pro-hormone when human beings evolve. We evolved in tropical climates and ran around naked. There was plenty of skin exposure to sunlight, and so there was no dietary need for vitamin D. As humans migrated away from that tropical regions, they actually created a need for vitamin D in food because sunlight was inadequate, particularly during the winter.
I suppose it's the truism to point out that citizens need to be well informed. Maybe it's something we take for granted in our liberal Western democracies, but there will be plenty of societies, well, that is run counter to explicit government policy. Many areas of the world still suffer from the reverie of the deliberate missing information. Governments, especially the unelected ones, but also some elected ones, have denied the events that have ever taken place. They pretend that other events did take place. They would help spin what they cannot deny, ensure they've used every trick of the book to pull the eyes of the world and in an attempt to cover up their mistakes.
For thousands of years, philosophers and astronomers, and thinkers of all sorts, have imagined that the universe, the space around us, was rather like this floor in front of us. It was fixed and unchangeable, and things happen on it, just as people walk around. So the stars, the comets, and the planets, and the other heavenly bodies moved around and traced down their parts on this completely unchanging stage of space. In the 20th century, as the result of Einstein's work, that view of the universe was completely transformed. We began to understand that there was no absolutely fixed stage of space at all on which all celestial notions were played out. But in some sense, on the larger scale in the universe, the space itself was in this state of a continuous dynamic change. That was a prediction made by Einstein. However, Einstein was not the first person to propose the theory, and the theory was proposed by an astronomer called Hubble in the 1920s.
Globalization is an overused and often misunderstood concept. We hear it all the time on news broadcasts and in any type of public discussion. But the starting point for understanding globalization is that it is industries and markets that globalize, not countries. That's why it's helpful to think of globalization as the integration of economic activities across borders. But why does globalization matter? I would argue globalization matters because it means the rise of interconnectedness between countries and markets across the world. For example, One of the reasons why the financial crash of 2007 to 2008 was so serious was because the financial and banking systems of countries around the world have become so closely interconnected with the globalization of markets. What's the literal definition of risk? Business schools use risk analysis. So what do you mean by risk? And we need a dictionary. When you look at dictionary, this is literal definition of risk. What it says is, the definition, for example, the possibility of injury, a dangerous element or factor, chance of, degree or possibility of such loss, and so on. So risk has two parts, as you look at the literal definition of risk. One part is the consequence of some kind of particular danger, hazard loss, and the other is about the probability of it, chance and consequence, okay? And then at least just as English language concerns, when you look up the word of safe and safety, what you'll earn as, it's a little bit of a loop, a little circular argument that free from harm or risks, secure from danger, harm or loss, the condition of being safe, and so on for all. And why we take out of it. At least when we talk about safe, at least in English language, we are talking absolute something is safe, or it sounds safe.
There are two main categories of memory. Implicit memory, which is also called procedural memory, cannot be consciously recalled. It is an experimental or functional form of memory, informed by cultural and social background. With implicit memory, behaviors are automatic. We recall implicit memories naturally, so we are not aware when we are using them. Examples of implicit memory include using languages naturally, driving automatically, reading and writing. When people try to consciously describe how to drive, they may misrepresent how they actually drive. What we often describe as bad memory is explicit memory. Explicit memory is also known as episodic memory, which is totally different from implicit memory. It's more about time and space, and is often related to personal life experiences. Some examples of explicit memory include remembering birthdays from many years ago, or answering multiple choice questions in a test. One of the most amazing things that's happened even in my lifetime is the prediction of cosmology. When I started out 40-odd years ago, we thought we knew that the universe began a Big Bang. Some people doubted even then. We thought the universe was about 10 or 20 billion years old. But now, for really very sound scientific reasons, we can say that the universe did start in a Big Bang and it's 13.8 billion years old. So it's not 14, it's not 13, because a decimal point in there, and that's a stunning achievement to know that. And we also know that the laws of physics that apply to tiny particles inside atoms also explains what happened in the Big Bang. You can't have one without the other. A very neat example of this is that when you apply nuclear physics, that kind of physics to understand how stars work, you find out that the oldest star in the universe is about 13 billion years old. So their universe is just a little bit older than the stars. Fantastic! If we'd done it and counted in the other way around, and said that the stars were older than the universe, we would say science were in deep trouble. But it's not. Everything fits together, and we know how the universe began. We got to know how the way it is. The future that it'll suspects we don't know quite well what's going, but we got some ideas, which are as good as those ideas we had 40 years ago about how Big Bang happened. Now we would like to look at a recent survey conducted by Canadian researchers on diet. Total 31 women volunteered in the survey. They have been told to participate in the exercise program without changing their diet. After a careful observation, the researchers found that some volunteers experienced a body fat change after 6 months from the day they have started the experiment. The findings further stated that some lost significant amount of fat, which led to decrease in body mass. On the other hand, there were others who did not lose fat at all. The study concludes that there must be two explanations. Those who did not lose weight must have eaten more, and another factor is that it is because there is psychological reason not to believe in losing fat.
So various conclusions. Yes, bees are in decline. These declines are well documented. They are real and reported by good, strong scientific evidence. It is the only evidence that counts. The drives to decline are many. They are varied depending on species. The fact of pollinator loss could be absolutely huge. So, is it a catastrophe? Not yet, but it could be. On the positive side, we're aware of the problem, aware this is being raised with time, and people are taking actions fast. We've recognized the problem, and that, at least, is being done.
Consumers are the core section of any business. In fact, the whole concept of any business is surrounded by the behavior of consumers, and the values of consumer is a crucial factor. Now, we have to understand a consumer is not to be taken lightly. He knows what product he wants. Consumers are extremely smart. They could make decisions about price and value of products in minutes or sometimes in few seconds. So, a business therefore needs to uplift its brand image. Consumers are willing to pay $15 more for quality products. However, the The conflict starts when manufacturers fail to meet the expectations. This lies in the basic fundamental of engineering in designing a product. Consumers want products to be softest, but at the same time, they also want product like toilet papers to be light and strong, something which can be easily be torn. The brand Tide is really good example. There was a problem of shaking the washing powder before being put into the machine as it caused the damage the material of the clothes. Tide had to made up to a lot of expectations for consumers.